Hi guys, Asmo here, and today I have for you my 6 recommendations for League starter builds for the 327 Keepers of the Flame Path of Exile 1 League. These are the recommendations that are basically builds that are on my radar. There is more builds that you could start, of course, but this is just things that I know are going to be good to start with, something that I'm going to be playing also myself, so I'm going to talk about that first, and then I'm going to give you a couple of other ideas of things that you should definitely look out for if you're interested in certain build archetypes, because there has been a lot of new added very interesting uniques, very interesting passives, and things that are very, very useful for some of these builds. So let's first talk about the thing that I'm going to be playing myself, and that is going to be RF Elementalist, that will transition into the Blade Vortex Elementalist or Occultist probably as soon as I can. So RF Elementalist has been hit with a small buff. So the buff to the golems, let me find the patch notes. Golem, so we have here the golems are basically nerfed by 50% effectiveness, this one node. So Liege of the Primordial, this gives you like +2 golems, something else, and 100% increased effect. Now 50% increased effect of golem buffs, but this is not even a 50% effect buff, because we're scaling that effect from also the passive tree, and there's also other sources that you can scale it from. So you don't really lose 50% effect of your golem buffs, you lose much less of it. So it is still strong, definitely just like a slap on the wrist for something that was extremely powerful to now just being powerful. So it's still going to be strong. I still recommend Elementalist as a league starter, and RF Elementalist is probably the fastest and the easiest league starter to play through the campaign, at least. This is a very, very strong archetype. As soon as you swap to RF at level 18, you basically just shield charge through the rest of the campaign and then only cast on bosses. That's it. It's extremely, extremely powerful, very quick to level, and basically very beginner friendly as well if you understand how to sustain your RF and basically where you can get a regeneration. And it's very easy to get, very easy to sustain, and I highly recommend it. So I'm going to be starting early on with RF Elementalist, but then RF Elementalist, when I started mapping with it, I found that it is a little bit squishy, and I want to see whether BV is going to be maybe equally squishy but have more damage and freeze, which will make it a little bit easier to survive on this character. So I'm gonna be probably transitioning to cold BV really early. I'm gonna be testing different times to transition from one to the other, but I definitely recommend either RF Elementalist, that will transition then into like fire, just Ignite Elementalist, which is going to be very strong as well. Ignite Elementalist, very, very strong archetype to start, especially because we're playing a Breach League, and RF Elementalist with like Ignite proliferation and explosions from many different sources can have extremely good and satisfying clear. So the BV, also transitioning to BV, for me there is one interesting thing from the new league, and that is the Primal Owl Bloodline Ascendancy. So that is giving you extra seals to unleash, so you're pressing the button once and you're getting a lot of blades, and then if the damage works, you can get, I think, like +9 unleashes, so you get like 5 damage for one blade, 10 damage for another, 15, 20, 25, 30, and so on. If that works for BV and the blade damage snapshots like that, then that would be extremely powerful. I'm not sure if that works. If it doesn't, then I'm just gonna stick with regular Elementalist and Occultist nodes, but this seems really, really powerful and seems like it has huge potential to be very, very strong for this archetype. So that is what I'm gonna be starting. RF Elementalist into BV, and I recommend like RF Elementalist into BV or into just Ignite Elementalist as a starter. Very, very solid. Then we have a Reap, Exsanguinate, Miner, perhaps Trickster. Trickster has been nerfed in many different ways, but it will still be good for that because you get the charges, which is what you care about. Or you could play it on something like a Saboteur, you could play it on something like perhaps Occultist, or maybe there is also other options. But definitely Exsanguinate Reap Miner was the most well-rounded character I have perhaps ever played when it comes to something that is not broken and overtuned and just destroys everything because of that, but because of like how it functions mechanically and how it works as a build. So Exsanguinate has a really, really good clear because of the chains, and that is also getting buffed, not compared to the last league, because in the last league we had like a super insane gloves that gave us +2 chains, but now we're getting a rune graft with +1 chains. So if you look in the patch notes, chain. There is the rune graft of refraction now, which gives you skills fire at most one projectile, which doesn't affect this skill because it doesn't fire projectiles. It just like tethers or tendrils or whatever they're called. And then it chains +1 times. So +1 chain for this means that you don't have to use chain support all the time, especially when you're doing content that you are, don't care about your clear speed that much, not a Legion, not a Breach. But if you're doing Legion or Breach, then it will hugely buff your clear as well. So that is very, very powerful for that. And then Reap is basically just a gem swap. You do one gem swap for bosses and suddenly you're playing a bossing build, right? That is like people literally use a Reap miner to rush bosses early on in the league because of how good Val Reap combined with the Reap is. This is giving you huge damage multiplier and is definitely something that is a big plus on a league start if you can do your bosses very easily yourself with just one gem swap. So if you don't mind having to do one gem swap early on, or just playing with Reap and having slightly lower clear early on, this is definitely a very, very powerful build that you can start with. It's very comfortable, good quality of life, very nice to play, amazing for breaches, amazing for legions, amazing for bossing, and then it scales well into the end game because you can just keep scaling it. You're going like cold damage and crit, and this type of archetype scales very, very well into the late game. The next build I was going to recommend was a Volcanic Fissure of Snaking Berserker. However, it got completely gutted. The single target damage is like 1/3 of what it was now. So since I'm not a melee expert, I don't really know what melee build will replace that. Maybe something like Earth Shatter, but it can transition to Strength Stacker relatively early, and Strength Stacker is going to be very, very strong this league. There is lots of different buffs to Strength Stacker, so I would highly recommend looking into that and trying to find. You can ask the people who play melee builds what is the strongest melee starter skill to get rolling with, and then transition into something that's like strength on a Berserker or a Scion or something like that. It's going to be definitely very, very powerful this league, but for starter you're gonna have to ask someone who plays melee. But I do know that the skill that's going to be really good for starting again this league, just as before, and partially also because of this +1 chain rune graft, is the Peacock of Bouncing Pathfinder. Poison Pathfinder is really good for breaches because of the poison proliferation, which can be also combined with explosions, and these explosions combined with low tolerance cluster jewels are giving you huge amount of like clear. It's absolutely insane clear. So Poison's Concoction has been slightly nerfed when you're not using flasks, but most of the time if you're playing Pathfinder you're gonna have these flasks, so the nerf is not really affecting you. Maybe like tiny amount of damage nerf in the like early leveling, which is still one of the strongest leveling skills in the game anyway, even after the nerf. So I highly recommend it as a league starter. And then Peacock of Bouncing getting +1 chain, Pathfinder being still really strong, and then it can transition into something like a Viper Strike of the Mamba, or just stay the Poison's Concoction of Bouncing, whatever you want to do. Like there's lots of poison skills that you can transition into. There is also a new dagger. I think I have it here. There is a dagger, yes, the Festering Resentment, that basically allows you to do the type of like you proc different abilities, like it triggered spells poison on a hit, and all damage from triggered skills can poison. So this is like an increased damage with poison spell damage. So some spell trigger poison stuff on Pathfinder might be also possible. So that's something I would also look into. Next we have another starter that I recommend is Archmage Hierophant. So Archmage Hierophant has not been very nerfed. It is still very strong, and it has a couple of options. Vortex of Projection, which has been nerfed for like a specific use, I think, but I think in general is still okay. But then the other option is Power Siphon of Archmage Ballista, which is extremely powerful, really, really good damage, scales well into the late game, and very easy to start with. So Archmage Hierophant, if you want to be mana stacking, this is definitely a good option for a league starter. Very strong build last league and hasn't been nerfed, so I definitely recommend it this league as well. The next thing, something that has been buffed, but it already was played last league, is a Wonder. So people who have been playing KB, so Kinetic Blast and Kinetic Bolt, last league they've been clearing breaches with that, just stacking Headhunter buffs and rushing like many breaches at the same time with massive clear speed. So Wonder has amazing clear speed, but it always lacked single target damage, and single target damage depends on a couple of different things. Number one, of course, is the number of like projectiles that you have and how many you can like shotgun the target with, and then also having a good weapon. And both of those things get buffed this league. So number one, we're getting the Wall of Force, which reflects the projectiles and makes them basically chain back to the target, whatever nearest target is. So on bosses, obviously it will be just the boss. So that is huge amount of single target. I think it will be absolutely insane amount of single target, and that is definitely fixing the single target for Wonder. And then the second buff is that there are new wand bases that are only attack based, which means they do not roll spell damage modifiers like increased fire spell damage or cold or lightning spell damage and damage to spells. Instead, they only roll the attack modifier, so it will be much easier to use essences or even use things like rogue and target farm these wands, or use something like harvest crafting, and just make wands for yourself on a league start that will be much better than you could do before, because you need much fewer tries and much fewer attempts, much fewer crafting resources to get a better wand now, because you simply can pick the base that only rolls the attack modifiers and get much more damage early on. So huge buff to the wonders. You can play them on something like a Deadeye. There is also other options. You can play on Trickster, maybe Assassin, Berserker also played this. So there's a lot of different options for wonders. And then we have a last recommendation, which will be minions. So minions were already in a really good state last league. They have been receiving buffs and buffs and buffs, and all of these buffs were like quality of life, and there's some quality of life and power buffs this league. So one of them is that you no longer require accuracy for minions to hit. So there were minions that were attacking and there were minions that were casting spells. The ones that were casting spells, of course, did not need accuracy, but the ones that did attack needed accuracy, and a lot of players didn't even realize that, and they were doing much less damage, or they had to invest into accuracy, masteries and passive points and other sources in order for these minions to hit with the full 100% accuracy. And that would lower your damage simply by the cost of the opportunity cost, where you have to spec into this accuracy. And now instead of that, you're going to simply spec into more damage and deal more damage, or just more survivability and have better uptime. So that is huge buff. Then you also get a Spectre QOL buff, where they get like resummoned when you get to the new zone. So that is very, very nice. It's much easier and faster to play with them. And then also we get this insane helmet, the Hallowed Monarch, which is, I think, an Uber drop, but it gives you basically a Headhunter buff for one of your minions, and you can use link skills on your minions, and your linked minions take 73% less damage. It is absolutely insane. This is a ridiculous helmet that is gonna make minions more fun and more powerful. The amount of damage and stuff you can get from links is huge. Like, link skills are very, very strong. People have been using them with the mercenaries last league, and they definitely discovered how powerful link skills are when you can use them yourself without a party. And of course, they're overpowered in a party play as well, because party play is just overpowered. But this is a very, very huge buff to minions, and a different playstyle for minions as well. So I definitely recommend it. They already had a really easy start. Minions have always been really good in the campaign and early leveling because of like just sheer amount of links you can use, right? Before you have a 6 link, you can have 4 link here, 4 link here, 4 link here, 4 link there, and then you have like multiple skills that are doing damage at the same time, compared to builds that usually have like 1 or 2 skills that do damage at the same time. So that's why early on they are very, very powerful. So those would be my recommendations. RF Elementalist transitioning into like Ignite Elementalist or BV, Exsanguinate and Reap Miner, which can be played on many different ascendancies, but probably still Trickster. Then we have Peacock of Bouncing Pathfinder, which can transition into any poison build like Viper Strike of the Mamba. And then we have Archmage Hierophant, which can be used with like Vortex of Projection, any other decent clearing skill, or something like Power Siphon of Archmage with Ballistas. Then we have a Wonder, huge buffs this league, and minions, which are keep receiving quality of life and buffs. And those will be my recommendations for starters. Other things you can look into that are basically just like ideas to look into are strength stacking, life stacking, and things like the Bitter Instinct, Retaliate, Bleed, or Ignite. So the Bitter Instinct is this new shield which allows you to use retaliation skills without blocking, basically, right? So these retaliation skills can be used only in every 4 seconds, but there's a different ways around it, right? Like one way around it is, for example, using damage over time. So using bleed or ignite or poison, so that you basically inflict a giant ignite and it deals damage for those 4 seconds while you wait for the skill to be usable again. So that's one way of doing it. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because these retaliate skills are insanely overtuned. They are ridiculously strong in terms of the numbers, but because of terrible QOL, they cannot be used very often. You have to wait for the block. That's why they weren't very popular, but I think Goratha had like a really strong like retaliate skill build, so I would definitely look into that. And the other one is Ratpith. So Ratpith is this shield that gives you increased spell critical strike chance per maximum life, and then increased spell damage per maximum life. Even just one of those is powerful. Like, this is a huge amount of damage that you're able to basically get generically for your build. And then there is also a really cool synergy that you can use with something like Corruption's Embrace, where you get life recovery from regeneration, grants blood barrier while on full life. Maximum blood barrier is equal to 30% of your maximum life. Damage from hits is taken from blood barrier before your life, and you get 50% less regeneration rate. So why is this OP? If you stack your life to like a really high amount, right, you get like a huge amount of life, then you can get 30% on top of that as a basically like a buffer. You're gonna be absolutely unkillable. You get huge amount of damage, but you need to have 8 corrupted items equipped, which I think it's not gonna be that difficult to do. You can do it in many different ways, but this can be really strong with something like Essence Drain. And Essence Drain typically is a shit skill that doesn't do any damage, but with life stacking and Ratpith, you can get anything to do damage. So Ratpith life stacker with this could actually be something that you would play like in hardcore and have ridiculous survivability, because you'd have like huge amount of life, like a giant life pool, and then 30% on top of that, and then you also get the insane regen and like good enough damage to clear everything in the game, right? So that would be an archetype I would definitely look into. Another option with Ratpith is something like, for example, Scion RF, which gets huge AoE and huge damage by like stacking strength and stacking life. So strength stacker, life stacker, definitely going to be very powerful. There is also a new jewel, I think, added. Can I find this jewel? Yeah, it's here. Like the Red Dream. Passives granting fire res or all elemental resistances in radius also grant increased maximum life at 100% of its value. So you can get huge amount of increased life in many different places on the passive tree. You can do like stuff with like different jewels in the middle. You can get stuff with like on the left side next to the Marauder, there is a good area where you can also like tattoo these different strength nodes into fire res to get even more of life. So a huge amount of life. We're gonna see life stackers with more life than ever before this league, I think. And it's going to be very strong. I definitely highly recommend looking into that. So that's it. Those will be my recommendations. I'm probably going to be working now on the way to level the RF Elementalist and when to transition to PvE. And when I figure that out, I'm going to post a guide and share that with you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.